Study of Micah.
Yes.
It's very interesting. Turn to Amos if you would. We will start there. We will stay there long. What I've done here is in an effort to try to summarize what you and I studied the previous couple of weeks while Pat was away. And I've tried to combine those in a brief way for a summary and let that lead into a devotional invitation for tonight. So if you're in Amos, one of the 2 or 3 things we emphasized the last couple of weeks was, one was, of course, Bible study, how important Bible study is, and secondly, how it's important to stay with it. And the way I did this is to remind us of Paul Harvey's.
Excuse me, this is just in the way of everyone sitting over here.
Okay. As I reminded us of Paul Harvey's weekly, he actually had a daily program. A lot of us listened to that. But part of his segment was the rest of the story. And so I used the Bible here to try to give us an idea of what he's talking about, help our Bible study, which of course builds our faith. So turn to Amos chapter 1 and verse 1. And I'm going to move along pretty quickly because we've already studied this. But my point is, in Amos 1:1, we learned a couple things about Amos. Okay? We only learned about 2 things. About the man, the prophet, Amos. We go to 1:1, where we learn a couple things. One of those is that he's a herdsman, right? We learn he's a herdsman. The other thing we learn is that where he's from. That's the village or town of Tekoa, which is about 10 to 12 miles south of Jerusalem, which puts it in the kingdom of Judah. Now, and we learn other things in verse 1, but we don't learn much more about Amos. And one of the points, of course, in Bible study is not always chronologically, and most of the time not chronologically in order. So my point was, if you study Amos 1, Amos 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and for some reason you put your Bible down and you decide to go study, well, I think I'll study the Gospels for a while. Well, you didn't get the rest of the story, did you? No, because you had to go to chapter 7 to get the rest of the story. So let's go there. 7 and 14 and 15. When we read through Amos, we know a little bit from the beginning. Now we get the rest of the story, verses 14 and 15. It says, Then answered Amos and said to Amaziah. Now Amaziah is a priest, and he's responding to a priest at that moment. And he says to Amaziah in verse 14, I was no prophet, neither was our prophet's son. So what's he saying? I'm not a professionally trained prophet, and I'm not the son of a prophet. Okay, that helps us understand. But he says, I was a herdsman, and there's that conjunction that gives us a world of information that we didn't have the rest of the stories. What? He's a tender of fruit. So he's an outdoorsman. He's doing 2 things. His 2 occupations. One is he's a herdsman. The other thing is he's a tender of sycamore trees. So that kind of gives us a really better feel for the rest of the story, what Amos was. Then what did the Lord tell him to do? Verse 15, the Lord took me as I followed the flock. When did God speak to him? He's out there working. Kind of reminds you of Moses with the burning bush. He was out there tending sheep and he was doing his job. And God spoke to him. Here's Amos out there doing his job. And God speaks to him. And the Lord said unto me, Go prophesy where? To my people Israel. I want you to go to the northern kingdom. And a further study in Amos we talked about tells us he spent most of his time in Bethel, in the northern kingdom, doing his prophecy. All right, now, again, that's an idea that the rest of the story. Let's go to Joshua chapter 2, and we'll pick up where we left off there. I'll briefly go through this, and I'll go through it pretty quick because you and I have already studied it, most of it. However, we didn't get the rest of the story with Rahab, and we'll do that tonight. Joshua, what happened here? Well, Rahab helps Joshua's 2 spies, doesn't she? Isn't that what this is all about? Moses sent out 12 spies. Joshua sends out 2. They come into Jericho, and Rahab, providence of God involved here, of course, she helps these 2 spies. Now, how does she help them? Let's look briefly what you and I studied last week. In chapter 2, verse 1, she helps them by letting them what? Come in her house. Okay? Helping method number 2, chapter 4. She says to the king's men who are chasing them, trying to find them, they got word they came into the town, they came into Jericho, the king knows about it, he knows that he's been reported to that they went in Rahab's house, and he sends men out. They go to Rahab's house in verse 4, she said, I don't know where they are. Help number 2, they go to her house. Help number 2, she says, I don't know where they are. In verse 4. Help number 3, look at verse 5, what'd she do? She puts them on the wrong trail. She says, look, I think they've gone that way. There they are right in the house. I think they've gone that way. If you hurry up and get out of the gate before dark, before they close the gate, you might be able to catch them. So she sends them on another way. Now, help number 4 is recorded in verse 6. She says, I'm going to take you up to the roof, and that's where we're going to put you to hide you. All right, that's another item of help. Now, then she says this in verses 12 and 13. I help you. How about returning the favor? Can you do that for me? In verses 12 and 13, that's exactly what we see. And she says, and if you look closely at the end of verse 13, very important point there, of course. Help us how? Last part of verse 13. Deliver our lives from what? She knows that Joshua's coming. She knows there's going to be mass destruction. Going to be death everywhere. And she says, look, we helped you. You 2 spies, we helped you. Now, how about you helping us by keeping us alive during this battle? That's what she asked in verse 13. And the men say, okay. That sounds like a fair thing. But you know, there are going to be 3 conditions. There will be 3 conditions. You know, God always holds true to all of his promises. But his promises are conditional. These men say, we're going to save your life, but you've got to do 3 things. We looked at a couple of them last week. Anybody remember any of the 3 things? And if you didn't, it just means I didn't do my job as a teacher, so don't worry about it. Anybody remember any of the 3 things that the spies said Rahab had to do?
Mark your house. Mark your house.
Yes.
Get all of her family in the house.
All right. That's good. You get an A. Everybody else gets an A too. Okay, here we are. Let's go to all 3. Verse 1, verse 14 is you've got to, Rahab, you've got to zip that. So you got to keep that opening below your nose closed. That's the first thing he said. You can't tell anybody. We have warfare, aren't we? Element of surprise. Okay. So in 14, and by the way, this is repeated in verse 20. He tells her twice. But anyway, verse 14, you got to be quiet. Don't tell anybody about this, Rahab. That's in verse 14. Now, what's the second condition for her physical salvation?
Stay in the house.
That's recorded in verse 18. And what did she have to put on a window? Had to put a scarlet or red thread, or some versions say rope, some say cord. My thinking as well, it's got to be a big enough something to see on the second floor. Think about this. Warfare is going on. They're coming down the street. They're throwing spears. They're shooting arrows. They're swinging their swords. There's hollering and screaming. There's got to be something that catch their eye pretty good up there, right? Okay, so it's a red thread, cord, rope, something visible. That's condition number 2. That's the second thing you got to do, Rahab. Now, what is the third thing Rahab's got to do? Now, that's recorded in verse 19.
Stay in the house.
Read that, Richard.
If any of you go outside your house unto the streets, their blood will be on their own heads, and we will not be responsible. As for those who are in the house with you, their blood will be on our head if a hand is laid upon them.
All right. There's your 3 conditions. Unless I missed one. I think that's it. 3 conditions. Stay in your house. Can't say anything about it. Put that red rope or red thread up there so we'll see and recognize this one individual house. Okay. Now, we looked through this last week. And what's the rest of the story? What is the rest of the story? Well, we know Jericho was conquered, don't we? We know about the walls falling, etc. We have to keep on reading, keep on studying. Again, it's like with Amos. We have to keep studying again. Now here we've got to keep studying. Chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4, chapter 5, and then we get to chapter 6. Look at Joshua 6, verse 25. Joshua chapter 6 and verse 25. Joshua 6:25. Robin, you want to read that for us?
And Joshua spared Rahab the harlot, her father's household, and all that she had. So she dwells in Israel to this day, because she hid the messengers whom Joshua sent to spy out Jericho.
Yeah, because she hid the messengers. She hid the spies, right? And she met all those conditions. Now, if we stopped our study, it's somewhere prior to 6:25, we wouldn't know, would we? The rest of the story. We know the rest of the story because we continue to study. So one of my main points, of course, is for us to continue to study. That's the only way to get our faith. Now, let's go back now for just a moment and look at what Rahab did. What did Rahab do? Internally, what did Rahab do? Let's look at, I'll go back to Joshua chapter 2. And you stay with me right here, verse 9 and 10. 9 and 10 of Joshua chapter 2. And one of the key words, of course, of what she did was in verse 10. Let's read 9 and 10. Debbie, you want to read 9 and 10 for me?
And said to the men, I know that the Lord has given you the land, that the terror of you has fallen on us, and that all the inhabitants of the land are faint-hearted because of you. For we have heard now the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites who were on the other side of the Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed.
All right. Now, she's heard, okay? She's heard, hasn't she? They're right across the Jordan River. You said they're coming. Joshua's coming with the army. And you're right across the river. You know what's going on. And she heard about this. And what was her response? Number one, she heard. In verse 11, it tells us what? She believed. Right? She believed. Dale, you want to read verse 11 for me, please?
And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no spirit left in any man because of you. For the Lord your God, He is God, like it's been page turn here.
She heard,
and on the earth beneath.
and she believed. Now, what else in verse 11 did she do? In verses 9 and 10, we see she's heard. In verse 11, she believed. And what else did she do in the last half of verse 11? Did she not confess that there's a God up there? That's exactly what she did, didn't she? All right? She's heard, she's believed that there is a God, and she's confessed that there is a God. Okay. She's convicted. It says here in the previous verse was in verse 9. It says in there that when you go on and can read this in succession, 1, 2, 3, you get to 11, it says our hearts did what?
Melted.
Our hearts melted. She got spiritual indigestion. Exactly what she's got. That's how it affected her. When you and I mentioned this last week, when you and I accepted or heard the truth of it, we heard and we believed, it hit us that way, didn't it? Oh yeah. We were convicted. We have to be very cautious and be careful how I say this, but You can get wet and come up not convicted. You can get wet. And if you don't have it here, you're not converted. And was she? Oh yeah. Her heart melted. She said, look, we're faint. It's a wonderful thing, but see that she heard, confessed, and believed. Now, all of this is summarized so well for us in the New Testament. It's just a wonderful thing to see how the old and the new, we all know the Old Testament pointing toward Jesus, pointing toward Jesus, pointing toward Jesus. Let's look at a couple of verses that summarize this better than I can say it. Let's look at Hebrews chapter 11, verse 31, please. Hebrews 11:31. Kathleen, you want to read that for us?
By faith, the harlot Rahab did not perish with those who did not believe when she had received the spies of peace.
What prompted her to do this? Faith is what did it. Now, faith alone? No, that doesn't work. Let's go to James chapter 2 now. James 2:25. James 2 and verse 25. Rita, you want to read that for us?
Yes, sir. Likewise also, was not Rahab the harlot justified by works, when she had received the messengers, and had sent them out another way?
All right, what we got? Have we got faith in works? Isn't that exactly what we've got to have in New Testament teaching? And James tells us 3 times, at least 3, maybe 4 in chapter 2, faith without works is. Rahab could say, look, glad to see y'all in town and hope everything goes good for you. No works there, right? No works, all right. So faith plus works is what I'm trying to emphasize tonight, and the fact that this lady who was a naughty girl turned into a godly woman because of the way her heart was affected by God's will. So we're going to have an invitation now, and you're going to have a song for us. Okay? I'll give you about 1 minute. Okay? And if in case that someone here is not a Christian, and you want to make the right action with your faith tonight, like Rahab did in a different way, that was Old Testament, New Testament. She had 3 things. Right? She heard, she believed, and she confessed God. Today, we hear and believe, we confess that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, we repent of our past sins, and we confess that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And then couple with one more, and that is not enduring to the end, which basically Matthew 10:22 says we have to stay with the program, not put our hand to the plow and look back. So tonight, if you're a subject in any way, what's our song number?
875.
875, and we'll be led by our brother. Please stand. Thank you.